The morning was unusually bright for a day that felt so dark to 8-year-old Sophie Parker. The sun seemed to mock the heaviness in her chest as she stood in her bedroom, staring at her reflection in the mirror. Her dad had helped her put on the black dress that morning, the one her mom had bought for her piano recital last spring. Sophie didn't want to wear it, not because she didn't like it, but because her mom should have been the one zipping it up, fixing her collar and telling her how pretty she looked. But her mom wasn't there, and she wouldn't be there ever again. "Sophie, are you ready, sweetheart?" Her dad's voice came from downstairs, gentle but strained. Sophie could hear the tiredness in it. He hadn't been sleeping much. Neither had she. She looked down at the worn teddy bear clutched in her small hands. Mr. Honey was what she called him. A soft golden brown bear with one eye that had to be sewn back on 3 times, and a blue bow tie that had faded to almost gray. Her mom had given him to her on her 5th birthday, and he'd been Sophie's faithful companion through every nightmare, every thunderstorm, and especially through the long days and nights at the hospital during her mom's illness. "We have to be brave today," Sophie whispered to Mr. Honey, straightening his bow tie. "For Mom." Downstairs, her dad was waiting by the front door. His suit looked too big on him now. He'd lost weight over the past few months, something Aunt Jenny had whispered about to Uncle Rob when they thought Sophie wasn't listening. Her dad tried to smile when he saw her, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You look beautiful, kiddo," he said, his voice catching a little. Sophie nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She held Mr. Honey tighter. The drive to the cemetery was quiet. Sophie watched the familiar streets of their small town pass by through the window. They drove past her school, past the ice cream shop where her mom would take her after dance class, past the park where they'd had a picnic just last summer. It felt strange that these places still existed when everything had changed so completely. Dad parked the car and Sophie felt a flutter of panic. She wasn't ready. How could anyone ever be ready for this? Her dad seemed to sense her fear. He turned in his seat to face her. "We can take all the time you need," he said softly. "And if it gets to be too much, you just squeeze my hand and we'll step away for a bit, okay?" Sophie nodded, grateful. She looked down at Mr. Honey in her lap. "Can I bring him?" she asked in a small voice. "Of course you can," her dad replied. "Mom would understand." The cemetery was filled with people, more than Sophie expected. There were neighbors, her mom's colleagues from the nature center where she worked, her dad's friends from the fire station, and even some of Sophie's teachers. They all spoke in hushed tones that grew even quieter when they saw Sophie approaching, holding her dad's hand with one of hers and clutching Mr. Honey with the other. People kept touching her shoulder or patting her head, telling her how sorry they were and how brave she was being. Sophie didn't feel brave. She felt small and lost and angry. Angry that her mom had gotten sick. Angry that the doctors couldn't make her better. Angry that everyone kept saying her mom was in a better place when the best place was right here, with her and Dad. The service began, and Sophie tried to listen to the words the pastor was saying about her mom, about how kind she was, how she loved nature and animals, how she had touched so many lives. These things were all true, but they didn't capture everything. They didn't mention how her mom could make animal shadows on the wall that made Sophie laugh until her stomach hurt. They didn't talk about her special pancakes shaped like hearts, or how she knew exactly the right way to braid Sophie's hair, so it didn't pull, or how she would make up silly songs about whatever they were doing at the moment. As people stood up to share memories, Sophie leaned against her dad, feeling the steady rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. She noticed he was clutching a handkerchief that had belonged to her mom, a small square of fabric with wildflowers embroidered in one corner. Her mom had taught herself to embroider during the long hours of chemotherapy. The handkerchief had been a gift to Dad on their last anniversary together. When it was time to approach the casket for the final goodbye, Sophie felt her feet grow heavy. Her dad squeezed her hand. "Together," he whispered. Standing before her mom's casket, covered in wildflowers and photographs, Sophie felt a strange calmness settle over her. This polished wooden box didn't feel like her mom. Her mom was sunshine and laughter, and warm hugs that smelled like lavender. Her mom was everywhere in the world around them, in the birds she loved to watch, in the trees she fought to protect, in the gentle way she taught Sophie to hold a butterfly without harming its wings. The burial was the hardest part. Sophie stood with her dad as they lowered her mom's casket into the ground. The sound of dirt hitting the wood made Sophie flinch each time. She buried her face in Mr. Honey's soft fur, breathing in the familiar scent that somehow still carried a trace of her mom's perfume from all the times her mom had held him. After the ceremony, people gathered at their house, the kitchen counters filled with casseroles and desserts that neighbors had brought over. Adults talked in low voices, occasionally glancing at Sophie with sad smiles. Sophie slipped away from the crowd, taking Mr. Honey with her to the backyard where her mom had planted a garden. The flowers were starting to bloom, purple cone flowers and black-eyed Susans that attracted butterflies and hummingbirds. Her mom had called it her wild patch and refused to make it look neat and tidy like other gardens in the neighborhood. Wild things need space to be themselves, she'd told Sophie once, just like people. Sophie sat on the small bench her dad had built for her mom's birthday last year. She held Mr. Honey in her lap, running her fingers over his worn ears. "She's not coming back," she told him quietly. "Not ever." Saying the words out loud made them feel real in a way they hadn't before. Tears that she'd been holding back all day began to fall, soaking into Mr. Honey's fur. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home and her dad had tucked her into bed, Sophie lay awake staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars on her ceiling. Her mom had put them there, carefully arranging them to match real constellations. Sophie could still hear her voice. "That's Ursa Major, the Great Bear. See? He's watching over you while you sleep." Sophie turned to look at Mr. Honey, propped against her pillow. An idea began to form in her mind, not fully shaped yet, but persistent. 3 weeks passed. Sophie returned to school. She sat through classes, ate lunch with her friends, and went through the motions of normal life. But nothing felt normal. At home, her dad tried his best, learning to make her sandwiches the way she liked them, helping with homework, even attempting to braid her hair, though never quite getting it right. They were both trying so hard to find a new way to live. Every night, Sophie talked to Mr. Honey about her day, just as she always had. But now, she also talked to him about her mom, afraid that if she didn't say the memories out loud, they might fade away. On Saturday morning, exactly 3 weeks after the funeral, Sophie approached her dad at the breakfast table. "I want to visit Mom today," she said, Mr. Honey tucked securely under her arm. Her dad looked up from his coffee, surprised but nodding. "Of course we can, sweetie." The cemetery looked different without all the people. It was peaceful, with birds singing in the trees and sunlight dappling the ground through the leaves. Sophie's mom had a spot beneath a young oak tree. The headstone was simple, with her name, dates, and the words, "Beloved wife and mother, protector of wild things." Sophie's dad stood a respectful distance away, giving her a moment alone. Sophie knelt beside the grave, placing her hand on the fresh soil. "Hi, Mom," she whispered. "I miss you. Dad does too. He tried to make pancakes yesterday, but they were all lumpy." She smiled a little at that, imagining how her mom would have laughed. "School is okay. Ms. Chen asks about you sometimes. The class planted a tree in your name in the playground. It's just a baby tree now, but they said it will grow really tall." Sophie fell silent, looking down at Mr. Honey in her hands. The bear had been with her through everything. Her first day of school, chicken pox, the scary night in the ER when she broke her arm, and all those nights in the hospital with Mom. He was more than just a stuffed animal. He was a keeper of secrets and tears and memories. Sophie thought about how her mom used to tuck Mr. Honey into bed with her each night, making sure he was comfortable. She thought about how Mom would sometimes talk to Mr. Honey in a funny voice that always made Sophie giggle. "I brought someone to stay with you," Sophie said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She carefully placed Mr. Honey against the headstone, adjusting him so he was sitting up properly. "His name is Mr. Honey, but you already know that," He's really good at keeping people company when they're sad or scared, and I thought, maybe you might need him more than me right now. The decision felt right, even though it hurt. Sophie leaned forward and whispered one last thing in Mr. Honey's ear, a message just for him to keep safe. When she stood up and walked back to her dad, he looked at her with a question in his eyes, noticing the missing bear. "You left Mr. Honey?" he asked gently. Sophie nodded, taking her dad's hand. "He's taking care of Mom for a while." Her dad's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't try to talk her out of it or tell her they could come back for the bear later. He seemed to understand that this was something important, something Sophie needed to do. As they walked back to the car, Sophie felt both heavier and lighter somehow. She looked back once at the small figure propped against her mother's headstone, a faithful sentinel keeping watch beneath the young oak tree. She didn't know then that in 3 days' time, the cemetery's security cameras would capture something that would change everything. The evening shift at Pine Grove Cemetery always started the same way for Harold Wilson. He'd park his old pickup truck in the staff lot, check in at the small security office, pour coffee into his thermos, and begin his rounds. At 67, Harold had been the night watchman here for nearly 20 years, ever since he'd retired from the police force. Most people couldn't understand why anyone would choose to spend their nights among the dead, but Harold found a certain peace in it. "Evening, Doris," Harold called as he entered the small brick building that served as the cemetery office. Doris Chen, the day shift administrator, was gathering her things to leave. "Right on time as always, Harold," she replied with a smile. "Not much to report today, just the usual visitors. Oh, and we had a young girl and her father at the Parker plot. The little one left her teddy bear there. Nearly broke my heart watching her." Harold nodded. He'd seen all manner of items left at graves over the years. Flowers and flags, of course, but also beer bottles, favorite books. Even a motorcycle helmet once. People found comfort in leaving pieces of themselves or their loved ones behind. "I'll keep an eye on it," Harold promised. "Make sure no one disturbs it." After Doris left, Harold settled into his routine. First, he checked the monitors that displayed feeds from the security cameras positioned around the cemetery. They weren't fancy, just basic surveillance cameras that recorded onto a hard drive. But they did the job. Then he'd walk the grounds, making sure the gates were locked and no one was lingering past visiting hours. The cemetery was different at night. During the day, it was a place of grief and remembrance, filled with mourners placing flowers and whispering prayers. But at night it belonged to nature. Owls called from the trees, raccoons waddled between the headstones, and occasionally deer ventured in from the adjacent nature preserve to graze on the well-kept grass. Harold liked these night visitors. They reminded him that life goes on, even in a place dedicated to those who had passed. He took his flashlight and began his first patrol of the night. The air was cool for late spring, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves overhead. Harold moved, slowly, his old knees protesting slightly as he walked the winding paths between the graves. He nodded respectfully at the names he passed, many of them folks he'd known in life. This was a small town after all. When he reached the newer section of the cemetery, Harold slowed his pace. He'd known Clara Parker, the woman who'd been buried here 3 weeks ago. Not well, but enough to exchange pleasantries when they crossed paths at the grocery store or town meetings. She'd worked at the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center just beyond the cemetery grounds, and sometimes Harold would see her releasing healed animals back into the nature preserve. She'd always had a kind word and a genuine smile, even during her illness. He found the grave easily enough, marked with fresh flowers and a simple headstone. And there, propped carefully against the stone, was a well-loved teddy bear. Its golden brown fur was worn thin in places. One eye looked like it had been resewn several times, and it wore a faded blue bow tie. Harold felt a tightness in his chest as he imagined the little girl leaving her treasured companion behind. "Well, little fella," Harold said softly to the bear, "looks like you've got a new job now." He carefully adjusted the bear so it was sitting more securely against the headstone, making sure it wouldn't topple over in the breeze. Then he continued on his rounds, thoughts turning to his own granddaughter and the stuffed rabbit she carried everywhere. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. Harold patrolled, took breaks to warm up his coffee and eat the sandwich his wife had packed him, and occasionally checked the security monitors. Around 2 a.m. he was in the security office, reviewing the day's footage, a habit left over from his police days, when movement on one of the screens caught his attention. Camera 4, which covered the newer section of the cemetery, showed a large shape moving between the headstones. Harold leaned forward, squinting at the grainy black and white footage. A deer, a good-sized doe, was walking deliberately through the graves. This wasn't unusual. Deer often came in from the preserve. But something about the way this one moved, with purpose rather than the usual cautious wandering, made Harold pay closer attention. The doe stopped at Clara Parker's grave. Harold watched, fascinated, as the animal seemed to inspect the teddy bear. It nudged the stuffed toy gently with its nose, then settled down beside the grave, folding its legs beneath it as if preparing to stay a while. The doe remained there, completely still except for the occasional twitch of its ears, for nearly an hour before rising and disappearing back into the darkness. "Well, I'll be," Harold murmured to himself. He rewound the footage and watched it again. There was something about the scene that felt significant, though he couldn't have explained why. The next morning, before ending his shift, Harold walked back to Clara's grave. The teddy bear was still there, though it seemed to be positioned slightly differently than before. Harold might have thought he'd misremembered how he'd placed it, except for the fact that he'd seen the deer interacting with it on the security footage. "I'll be keeping an eye on you, little buddy," he told the bear. For the next few nights, Harold paid special attention to camera 4 during his shift. The doe didn't return immediately, but on the 4th night after he'd first spotted it, the deer appeared again. This time, Harold was watching the live feed when it happened. Just after 2:30 a.m., the doe emerged from the tree line and made its way directly to Clara's grave. There was no hesitation, no meandering. It walked straight to the teddy bear as if visiting an old friend. Again, it nudged the bear with its nose, and then did something that made Harold gasp. The doe carefully took the bear's arm in its mouth and adjusted its position almost as if tucking it in. Harold grabbed his jacket and flashlight. He had to see this for himself. Moving as quietly as his old joints would allow, Harold made his way toward the Parker plot. He kept his flashlight pointed at the ground, not wanting to startle the deer with the bright beam. As he approached, he could make out the silhouette of the doe in the moonlight, still beside the grave. Harold stopped a respectful distance away and simply watched. The doe was lying next to the teddy bear, its body curled slightly around the grave as if in protection. It had noticed Harold. Its ears were perked in his direction, but it showed no fear. They regarded each other in the moonlight, two night guardians sharing a sacred watch. After a few minutes, Harold nodded to the doe and slowly backed away. Some things deserved their privacy. Back in the security office, he replayed the footage from previous nights, looking more carefully now. Sure enough, the doe had visited the grave several times in the last 3 weeks, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., always approaching the teddy bear with what could only be described as gentleness. Harold considered telling someone about what he'd seen, but who would believe him? They'd say it was just a curious animal or that he was an old man seeing things that weren't there. Besides, there was something about this that felt private, a secret between the knight, the doe, and the little girl's teddy bear. Instead, Harold started keeping a log. Each night, he noted the time of the doe's arrival, how long it stayed, and any interactions with the bear or the grave. He noticed patterns emerging. The visits always happened on clear nights when the moon was visible, never during rain. The doe always approached from the same direction, always spent time with the bear, and always left before dawn. 2 weeks after he first noticed the deer, Harold was having coffee with Bill Tucker, one of the groundskeepers, before starting his shift. "Say, Bill," Harold said casually, "did you know Clara Parker well? The woman who passed a few weeks back?" Bill nodded as he stirred sugar into his coffee. "Not real well, but I knew her from the Wildlife Center. My nephew volunteers there. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. Her little girl left a teddy bear at her grave. Been keeping an eye on it." That sounds like Clara's influence, Bill said with a sad smile. She was always teaching kids to process grief in healthy ways. She ran this program at the Center for Children who had experienced loss, had them work with the animals as a way to heal. Harold's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips. What kind of animals? All sorts. Birds, rabbits, whatever needed rehabilitating. But her specialty was deer, Bill replied. She had a way with them like I've never seen. There was this one doe she nursed back to health after it was hit by a car. Thing wouldn't leave her side during the whole recovery. Followed her around like a puppy. What was the name she gave it? Something sweet. Honey, Harold suggested, remembering the name embroidered on the teddy bear's bow tie. That's it. Honey. How'd you know? Harold smiled. Just a guess. That night, when the doe made its appearance at camera 4, Harold watched with new understanding. This wasn't just any deer visiting a random grave. This was Honey, coming to visit the woman who had saved her, guided by some instinct or connection that went beyond human understanding. As he watched the doe gently nuzzle the teddy bear, adjusting it so it sat more comfortably against the headstone, Harold felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. In 20 years of watching over this cemetery, he'd seen many strange and beautiful things, but nothing quite like this. He wondered what the little girl would think if she knew. Would it bring her comfort to know that her mother was being watched over not just by her teddy bear, but by one of the wild creatures her mother had loved so much? Harold added a new entry to his log, but this time, he wrote more than just the time and duration of the visit. This time, he wrote, Honey. Returned tonight. She's making sure Mr. Honey is comfortable. Some connections, it seems, transcend even death. He didn't know it yet, but in the coming days he would have a decision to make. One that would bring a grieving child and her father back to the cemetery to witness something truly extraordinary. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, pushing cereal around in her bowl. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, catching the dust particles floating in the air. It had been nearly 3 weeks since she'd left Mr. Honey at her mom's grave. 3 weeks of reaching for him at night before, remembering he wasn't there. 3 weeks of whispering her secrets to an empty pillow instead. Her dad noticed her playing with her breakfast. He sat down across from her, his own coffee mug steaming between his hands. Penny for your thoughts? He asked gently. Sophie shrugged, then looked up at him. Do you think Mr. Honey is okay? Her dad's eyes softened. I'm sure he is. He's doing an important job, remember? Sophie nodded, but doubt flickered across her face. What if it rains, or what if someone takes him? Her dad considered this for a moment. Would you like to visit him? We could go this afternoon after I finish up some work. Sophie's face brightened immediately. Can we? Really? Of course. I think it would be good for both of us to visit Mom anyway. Sophie pushed her cereal bowl aside, suddenly energized. I'm going to draw a picture to bring her. As Sophie dashed off to find her colored pencils, her dad watched her with a mixture of love and sadness. These small moments of happiness had become precious to him. Grief came in waves for both of them, sometimes crashing over them unexpectedly, other times receding enough to let them breathe and even smile again. Meanwhile, across town at Pine Grove Cemetery, Harold was just ending his night shift. He'd spent the last hour meticulously reviewing footage from the previous night and updating. His log, the doe, Honey, had made her longest visit yet, staying by Clara's grave for almost 3 hours. But it was what happened during those hours that had Harold reviewing the footage again and again. For the first time, Honey hadn't come alone. The footage clearly showed a second deer, a young buck with small antlers just beginning to grow, following behind Honey. The 2 deer had approached the grave together, and while Honey went through her now familiar routine of adjusting the teddy bear, the buck had stood watch nearby, occasionally dipping his head as if in respect. Harold rubbed his tired eyes. He was due to hand over to the day shift in 15 minutes, but something told him to make one last check on the Parker grave before he left. The morning was warm and still as Harold made his way through the cemetery. Birds called to each other, From the trees and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed as the groundskeepers began their day's work. When he reached Clara's grave, Harold stopped short. The teddy bear had been moved. Not just slightly adjusted as had been happening, but completely relocated. It now sat in a small hollow at the base of a young oak sapling that had been planted, near the headstone. Around the bear was a semicircle of small purple wildflowers, coneflowers, Harold thought they were called, that hadn't been there the day before. Harold knelt down, examining the scene carefully. The flowers hadn't been cut and placed there. They had been transplanted with their roots intact, the soil around them still damp and fresh. The bear sat nestled among them as if in a tiny garden, looking out at the world with its one good eye. What in the world? Harold murmured to himself. Just then his radio crackled. Harold, you still here? It was Meg, the day shift supervisor. Harold keyed his radio. Yeah, Meg, just doing a final check. Listen, could you come over to the Parker plot? There's something you should see. Meg arrived a few minutes later, clipboard in hand. She was in her 40s, practical and no nonsense, but with a kindness that made her good at her job dealing with grieving families. What am I looking at, Harold? She asked, glancing at the teddy bear and flowers. Harold scratched his head. That's what I'm trying to figure out. The bear was propped against the headstone yesterday. Now it's been moved, and these flowers have been planted around it. Did any of the grounds crew do this? Meg shook her head. Not that I know of. We don't usually move personal items left at graves unless they're in the way of maintenance or become damaged. She checked her clipboard. And I don't have any record of a planting request for this plot. Harold hesitated, then made a decision. I think you should see something. Back in the security office, Harold pulled up the footage from the previous night. Meg watched, her expression changing from skepticism to amazement as the video played. The timestamp read 2:17 a.m. Honey appeared first, emerging from the tree line as usual. The young buck followed close behind. Together, they approached Clara's grave. What happened next defied explanation. Honey carefully took the teddy bear in her mouth and moved it to the base of the sapling. Then, while the buck stood watch, she began digging small holes in a semicircle around the bear with her hooves. Is she planting something? Meg asked incredulously. Harold nodded, still watching the screen. Keep watching. The video showed Honey returning to the woods briefly, then coming back with something in her mouth. What looked like plant material with roots dangling. One by one, she placed small plants into the holes she had dug, tamping down the soil with her hooves. The entire process took nearly an hour. Those are coneflowers, Meg said. From the nature preserve, I'd guess. But how did she? Why would she? Her name is Honey, Harold said quietly. She was rehabilitated by Clara Parker at the Wildlife Center. The bear belongs to Clara's daughter. Meg stared at him, then back at the screen where the doe was making final adjustments to her creation. This is, I don't even have words for what this is. Harold rubbed his tired eyes. Neither do I. But I think there's a little girl who might want to see this. After some discussion, they agreed that Meg would contact the Parker family. Harold, though off duty, decided to stay. He wanted to be there when they came. Across town, Sophie had filled her backpack with treasures to bring to the cemetery. A drawing of her family, including her mom with angel wings, a small jar of honey from the farmer's market, her mom's favorite, and a new blue ribbon to replace Mr. Honey's faded bow tie. When the phone rang, her dad answered it in the kitchen. Sophie didn't pay much attention until she heard him say, "Today? Yes, we're planning to visit anyway." Something about the teddy bear. Sophie's head snapped up. She abandoned her drawing and ran to the kitchen, tugging on her dad's sleeve. "What about Mr. Honey? Is he okay?" she asked anxiously. Her dad covered the phone receiver with his hand. "He's fine, sweetie. That was someone from the cemetery. They said there's something special they want to show us when we visit today." Sophie's imagination went wild during the car ride. Maybe Mr. Honey had been chosen for a special cemetery honor. Maybe they were going to put him in a glass case to protect him from the rain. Maybe angels had visited him. When they arrived at the cemetery, A woman with a clipboard and a kind smile met them at the entrance. "You must be the Parkers. I'm Meg, the day supervisor here. Thank you for coming on such short notice." Sophie's dad shook her hand. "This is Sophie. We were planning to visit today anyway. Your call made us curious, though." Meg smiled at Sophie. "We have something quite remarkable to show you. There's someone who can explain it better than I can." She gestured toward an older man standing nearby. "This is Harold Wilson, our night watchman." Harold approached them with a warm smile. He had kind eyes that crinkled at the corners and a face that reminded Sophie of her grandfather. "It's nice to meet you," Harold said, bending slightly to address Sophie directly. "I've been keeping an eye on your teddy bear for you." Sophie's eyes widened. "You have? Is he okay?" Harold nodded. "He's doing just fine. More than fine, actually. He's made a friend." Sophie looked confused. "A friend? It might be easier if I show you," Harold said. "I have something on camera I'd like you to see first, and then we can go visit your bear. Would that be okay?" Sophie looked up at her dad, who nodded encouragingly. "Okay," she agreed. In the small security office, Harold pulled up the footage he'd been gathering over the past weeks. He'd edited it into a short compilation, showing Honey's visits from the first night to the most recent one with the flowers. Sophie watched in stunned silence, her mouth forming a perfect O of surprise. Her dad put his arm around her shoulders, equally amazed. "That's a deer," Sophie said finally. "A real deer is visiting Mr. Honey?" Harold nodded. "Not just any deer. Her name is Honey." "Like Mr. Honey?" Sophie asked, her eyes wide. "Yes, exactly like that. And here's the special part. Your mom helped. This deer, when she was hurt, she took care of her at the wildlife center where she worked. Now it seems like Honey is returning the favor by taking care of your bear." Sophie's dad's voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "Clara rehabilitated a doe named Honey about 2 years ago. She had been hit by a car and had a broken leg. Clara nursed her back to health." Harold nodded. "I found that out from one of our groundskeepers who knew your mom from the wildlife center. The connection seemed too strong to be coincidence." Sophie was bouncing with excitement. "Can we go see Mr. Honey now? And the flowers?" "Of course," Harold said. "But there's one more special thing. Honey usually only comes at night, but..." He pointed to a live feed on one of the monitors. There, in broad daylight, standing at the edge of the woods near Clara's grave, was a doe. She seemed to be waiting. "Is that her?" Sophie whispered. Harold nodded. "I think she knows you're here." The walk to her mother's grave felt different this time for Sophie. Instead of the heavy sadness that had weighed her down before, she felt a flutter of excitement. Her mom had always told her that everything in nature was connected, that love traveled in circles that couldn't be broken. Now, she was seeing proof of that right before her eyes. When they reached the grave, Sophie gasped with delight. Mr. Honey sat in his little garden of purple flowers, looking well cared for and at home, and at the edge of the nearby woods watching. Them with gentle brown eyes stood Honey the doe. "She's beautiful," Sophie whispered, squeezing her dad's hand. For a long moment, no one moved. The doe and the humans regarded each other across the short distance, connected by the small teddy bear who sat among the flowers. Then, slowly, deliberately, Honey bowed her head, as if in greeting, or perhaps in promise. Sophie felt tears on her cheeks, but they weren't sad tears. For the first time since her mom died, she felt something that had been missing, a sense that somehow, in ways she couldn't understand, her mom was still part of the world, still sending love, still creating connections. Sophie stepped forward and whispered, "Thank you for taking care of Mr. Honey." The doe raised her head, ears alert, eyes fixed on Sophie. Then, with a graceful turn, she disappeared into the woods, but somehow Sophie knew she would be back. Word of the extraordinary events at Pine Grove Cemetery spread quickly through the small town. It started as whispers between the cemetery staff, then expanded to friends and family, until it seemed everyone had heard some version of the story about the deer visiting a little girl's teddy bear. Sophie's dad, Tom, was hesitant at first about all the attention. He worried about how it might affect Sophie, who was still processing her grief. But Sophie surprised him. She seemed to draw strength from the story, proudly telling her classmates about Honey the deer and how she was looking after Mr. Honey at her mom's grave. "Mom always said animals understand more than we think," Sophie told her dad one evening as he tucked her into bed. "She was right, wasn't she?" Tom smiled, smoothing her hair back from her forehead. "Your mom was right about a lot of things." It had been a week since their visit to the cemetery, a week of small but noticeable changes in their home. Sophie had started talking about her mom more freely, sharing memories that made them both laugh and cry. Tom had found himself doing the same, telling Sophie stories about when he and Clara first met, about their wedding day, about the night Sophie was born, and how Clara had cried happy tears. The heavy silence that had filled their house was gradually being replaced by something warmer, not happiness exactly, but a kind of peace that came from remembering together rather than suffering alone. On Friday afternoon, Tom picked Sophie up from school to find her bursting with excitement. "Dad, Ms. Rivera said we can do our special project about Honey and Mr. Honey," she exclaimed as she climbed into the car. "That's great, sweetheart," Tom replied, helping her with her seatbelt. "What kind of project is it?" "It's for Earth Day. We're supposed to share a story about how humans and animals are connected. Ms. Rivera said our story is perfect. Can we go to the cemetery this weekend so I can take pictures for my presentation?" Tom hesitated. He wasn't sure how he felt about Sophie turning her mother's grave into a school project. But the genuine excitement in her eyes was something he hadn't seen in months. "Let me call Mr. Wilson first," he said. "We should make sure it's okay with the cemetery." Harold was more than supportive when Tom called him. "Of course she can take pictures," he said. "Actually, there's something new I think you both should. See? The doe, Honey. She's been busy again." That Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. Sophie was up early, packing her small digital camera and a notebook into her backpack. She'd added a new item to bring to the cemetery, a small hand-carved wooden deer that her art teacher had helped her make. "It's for Mom," she explained, to Tom. "So she knows I made a new friend." The cemetery was quiet when they arrived. Harold met them at the entrance, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw Sophie. "There's our wildlife photographer," he said warmly. "Ready to see what Honey's been up to?" Sophie nodded eagerly and Harold led them toward Clara's grave. As they walked, he explained what had been happening. "Honey has been coming every night now, not just when there's moonlight. And she's been bringing gifts." Tom looked puzzled. "Gifts?" Harold nodded. "You'll see." When they reached Clara's grave, Sophie gasped in delight. The small garden around Mr. Honey had expanded. There were more wildflowers, not just the purple coneflowers, but yellow black-eyed Susans, white daisies, and tiny blue forget-me-nots. Mr. Honey sat in the center, his faded bow tie now adorned with a small cluster of blue feathers, likely from a blue jay, tucked into the knot. But the most surprising additions were arranged in a neat semicircle in front of the bear. A perfect pine cone, 3 smooth river stones in graduating sizes, an apple that had been nibbled around the middle, and what looked like a small bird's nest, carefully placed and filled with soft moss. "Honey brought all this?" Tom asked, kneeling to examine the collection. Harold nodded. "Every night she brings something new. The groundskeepers have been leaving it all in place. Nobody wants to disturb what's happening here." Sophie circled the grave, taking pictures from different angles. Her face was alight with wonder. "It's like a fairy garden," she said softly. "Mom would love it." Harold glanced at Tom. "There's more. I've been keeping track of when Honey visits and for how long. There's a pattern." He pulled a small notebook from his pocket and opened it to a page filled with dates and times. "See here? She always comes between 2 and 4 a.m. Never earlier, never later. And she stays exactly 1 hour and 17 minutes each time." Tom looked at the meticulously kept log. "That's specific." Harold nodded. 1 hour and 17 minutes. The wildlife center where your wife worked is at 117 Pine Road. Maybe it's a coincidence, but Mom's favorite number was 17, Sophie interrupted, looking up from her photography. She said it was lucky because that's how old she was when she knew she wanted to work with animals. Tom and Harold exchanged glances. There's something else, Harold continued. The young buck that comes with her sometimes. He's been bringing his own offerings. He pointed to the pine cone and river stones. He's the one who brought these. It's all on the security footage. Sophie looked thoughtful. Maybe he was one of Mom's animals, too. That's what I was thinking, Harold agreed. I spoke with Betty at the Wildlife Center yesterday. She said your mom rehabilitated a young male fawn around the same time as Honey. They were kept together. For a while. Tom shook his head in amazement. Clara never mentioned that. She worked with so many animals over the years. Betty said they named him Scout, Harold added, because he was always exploring, getting into everything. Sophie giggled. That sounds like something Mom would say. While Sophie continued taking pictures, Harold pulled Tom aside. There's been some interest in your daughter's story, he said, quietly. A reporter from the local paper called the cemetery office yesterday. Someone tipped them off about what's been happening here. Tom frowned. I'm not sure how I feel about that. Harold held up his hands. I told them they'd need to speak with you directly. I wouldn't share anything without your permission. Tom watched Sophie as she carefully placed her wooden deer figurine next to Mr. Honey. She was talking softly to the bear, telling him about her week at school. Let me think about it, Tom said finally. Part of me wants to keep this private, but another part thinks Clara would have loved for people to know about this connection between her work and what's happening now, Harold finished for him. I understand. Take your time deciding. Later that afternoon, as they were leaving the cemetery, Sophie asked if they could come back that night. I want to see Honey, she explained. For real, not just on the security camera or from far away. Tom exchanged a look with Harold, who had walked them back to their car. Honey only comes in the middle of the night, remember? Tom said gently. That's way past your bedtime, Sophie's face fell. But it's Saturday, I don't have school tomorrow. Harold cleared his throat. If I might make a suggestion, why don't you both come back around dusk? Honey probably won't approach the grave while you're there, but sometimes she watches from the tree line. You might catch a glimpse of her. Sophie's eyes lit up. Can we, Dad? Please? Tom hesitated, then nodded. I suppose we could have a picnic dinner here, if that's allowed. He looked questioningly at Harold. Not usually, Harold admitted. But I think we can make an exception. The bench under the oak tree gives you a good view of the grave without being too close. And so, as the sun began its descent, Tom and Sophie returned to the cemetery with a small cooler of sandwiches and thermoses of hot chocolate. Harold met them at the gate and led them to the bench he'd mentioned, which was positioned about 50 feet from Clara's grave with a clear sightline. I'll be in the security office if you need anything, Harold told them. Just keep your voices low and movement slow. Honey is skittish around most people. As Harold walked away, Sophie unwrapped her sandwich, but barely took a bite. Her eyes were fixed on the tree line beyond her mother's grave, watching for any sign of movement. Do you think she'll really come? She whispered to her dad. I don't know, sweetheart, Tom answered honestly, but it's worth waiting to find out. The cemetery was beautiful at dusk. Long shadows stretched across the grass, and the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. The air was cool but not cold, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Tom found himself relaxing on the bench, his arm around Sophie's shoulders as they watched and waited. An hour passed. Sophie had finally eaten her sandwich and was sipping her hot chocolate, her eyelids growing heavy despite her determination to stay alert. Tom was just about to suggest they pack up when Sophie suddenly stiffened beside him. Dad, she breathed, barely making a sound. Look. At the edge of the trees, partially hidden by shadow, stood Honey. The doe was perfectly still, watching them with alert eyes, her ears focused in their direction. Behind her, less visible but definitely present, was the young buck. Scout. They came. Sophie whispered, her voice filled with awe. Tom felt his throat tighten with emotion. They did. For several minutes, no one moved, not the humans on the bench, not the deer at the tree line. They simply regarded each other across the distance, sharing the quiet evening and the space around Clara's final resting place. Then, slowly, deliberately, Honey took a step forward. Then another. The E. Buck remained at the tree line, watchful and protective, but the doe continued her careful approach. She stopped about halfway between the trees and the grave, still a safe distance from the humans, but closer than she had ever willingly come before. Sophie's hand found her father's and squeezed tight. Honey lowered her head to graze, a surprisingly normal action in such an extraordinary moment, but Tom understood. The doe was showing them something important, that she felt safe enough to eat in their presence, that she accepted their being there. As the darkness deepened around them, Honey gradually made her way to Clara's grave. She inspected Mr. Honey and the garden she had created, nudging a few things into better positions with her nose. She didn't stay long, perhaps sensing that her usual visiting hours weren't yet upon them, but before she returned to the woods, she looked directly at Sophie and Tom on their bench. Sophie raised her hand in a small wave. "Thank you," she mouthed silently. Honey's ears flicked forward, and then she turned, walking unhurriedly back to scout in the shelter of the trees. As they packed up their picnic in the growing darkness, Sophie was quiet, thoughtful. "You okay?" Tom asked, zipping up the cooler. Sophie nodded. I think Mom sent Honey to tell us something." "What's that?" Sophie considered for a moment. "That even though she's gone, she's still taking care of us, and that we should take care of each other too." Tom pulled his daughter close, his heart both breaking and healing at the same time. "I think you're absolutely right." What neither of them knew was that Harold had been recording their entire evening from the security office, capturing a moment of connection that would soon touch far more lives than just their own. The article appeared in the Sunday edition of the local paper, complete with photographs. After much thought, Tom had agreed to share Sophie's story, hoping it might bring comfort to others struggling with loss. Harold had provided carefully selected stills from the security footage, showing Honey tending to Mr. Honey and bringing her gifts. Sophie had proudly contributed her own photos from their visits. "Wild Compassion Deer Keeps Vigil at Wildlife Worker's Grave," read the headline. The story detailed Clara's work at the Wildlife Center, Honey's rehabilitation, and the remarkable events that had unfolded at Pine Grove Cemetery over the past month. No one expected what happened next. By Monday morning, the story had been picked up by several online news outlets. By Tuesday, a national morning show had contacted Tom, asking if they could interview Sophie and visit the cemetery. By Wednesday, Pine Grove was fielding calls from people across the country who wanted to know more about the deer that seemed to be honoring the memory of the woman who had saved her. "It's gotten a bit out of hand," Harold told Tom during one of their now regular phone calls. "We've had to put up temporary fencing around Clara's grave to protect the garden Honey made. People keep trying to leave their own trinkets there." Tom sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm sorry about that. Maybe we shouldn't have gone public with the story." "Don't be sorry," Harold said firmly. "I've been working here for 20 years. I've seen a lot of grief, a lot of heartbreak, but I've never seen something bring so much hope to so many people." It was true. The cemetery had received dozens of letters from people sharing their own stories of loss and healing. Parents who had lost children, children who had lost parents, people who had lost partners, all of them finding comfort in the story of a deer keeping vigil over a teddy bear. Sophie's school project had evolved into something bigger. With Ms. Rivera's help, she was creating a small book about her mother, Mr. Honey, and their deer friends. Sophie's classmates had contributed illustrations, and their parents had pitched in to help with printing costs. They planned to sell the book to raise money for the wildlife center where Clara had worked. "Mom would like that," Sophie had said when the idea was proposed. "Using the story to help more animals." On a chilly morning in early fall, About 2 months after Mr. Honey had first been left at the grave, Sophie received a special delivery at school. It was a package from the State University's biology department, addressed to Sophie Parker, wildlife observer. Inside was a letter from Dr. Vivian Chen, a professor who specialized in deer behavior. Dear Sophie, the letter read, I was deeply moved by the story of Honey the deer and your mother. As a scientist who has studied deer for over 30 years, I can tell you that what Honey is doing is extraordinary. Deer are capable of forming strong bonds and remembering humans who have shown them kindness, but the level of deliberate ritual behavior Honey is displaying goes beyond anything previously documented in scientific literature. The package also contained a beautiful hardcover book about deer, with a handwritten note inside the cover. For a future wildlife biologist, perhaps. That evening, Sophie sat at the kitchen table with her dad, paging through the book with wonder. Dad, she said suddenly, looking up at him with serious eyes. I know what I want to do when I grow up. Tom smiled, already guessing the answer. What's that, sweetheart? I want to work with animals like Mom did. I want to help them and study them and tell their stories. Tom felt his heart swell with a mixture of pride and bittersweet joy. Clara would have been so proud to hear those words. That sounds perfect, he told her. Your mom would love that. Later that week, Tom received a call from Betty at the Wildlife Center. She had an unusual request. We're releasing 3 rehabilitated fawns back into the wild tomorrow, she explained. Normally we don't have an audience for releases, but given everything that's happened, well, we thought Sophie might like to be there. These fawns were born to a doe that Clara helped save last year. It feels like coming full circle. The next day, Sophie stood at the edge of the nature preserve that bordered the cemetery, watching as Betty and another wildlife worker opened the doors of a transport carrier. 3 spotted fawns hesitated at the entrance, their large ears flicking nervously. It's okay, Betty coaxed them gently. You're home now. One by one, the fawns stepped cautiously from the carrier, their slender legs unsteady on the forest floor. They looked around, sniffing the air, adjusting to freedom. Sophie held her breath, her hand tight in her father's grip. Betty had explained that released animals often bolted immediately into the woods, their wild instincts taking over. But these fawns seemed in no hurry. The smallest one even took a few steps toward the humans before its siblings bleated softly, calling it back. They're beautiful, Sophie whispered. As if in response to her voice, the fawns' heads turned in unison, ears alert. Then, from deeper in the forest came another sound, a familiar snort and the soft thud of hooves on earth. Betty gasped. Look, there. At the edge of a clearing about 50 yards away stood Honey, her tawny coat gleaming in the dappled sunlight. Beside her was Scout, his small antlers now more prominent. The 2 deer regarded the scene with what could only be described as interest. Did you know they'd be here? Tom asked Betty in a hushed voice. Betty shook her head, her eyes wide. This is their natural territory, but we never know where exactly. They'll be at any given time. Well, it's quite a coincidence, but Sophie didn't believe it was a coincidence at all. As they watched, Honey took a few steps toward the fawns, then stopped as if inviting them to follow. The smallest fawn started forward, followed more hesitantly by its siblings. She's adopting them, Betty said in amazement. That's not common behavior for a doe with no fawns of her own this season. She knows they're special, Sophie said with absolute certainty. She knows they're connected to Mom. No one argued with her. The release was deemed a success, and as they walked back toward the parking lot, Betty had another surprise for Sophie. The Wildlife Center's board met last week, she said. We've decided to name our new rehabilitation area after your mother. The Clara Parker Healing Garden will be a special space where our recovering animals can transition between medical care and release. Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but they were happy tears. Can I visit sometimes? To see the animals? Betty smiled. Actually, we were hoping you might be interested in our junior volunteer program. You'd need to wait until you're 10. That's just a few months away, right? But we could save a spot for you. Sophie looked up at her dad, her face glowing with excitement. Tom nodded, his throat too tight for words. That evening, they made what had become their weekly visit to the cemetery, the temporary fencing around. Clara's grave had been removed, though small signs requested visitors to respect the space. To everyone's relief, people had been remarkably considerate, observing the garden from a distance and leaving their own memorials in a designated area. Nearby, Mr. Honey still sat in his place of honor among the flowers, which had continued to flourish despite the advancing season. His fur was a bit more weathered now, his remaining eye slightly faded from sun and rain, but he looked at home there. Sophie no longer felt sad when she saw him. Instead, she felt a warm certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. They sat on their usual bench. Sophie reached into her backpack and pulled out a small leather-bound journal, a gift from Harold. "I'm going to record everything I see today," she explained to her dad. "Dr. Chen said that's what real wildlife researchers do. They write down their observations." Tom smiled, watching as his daughter carefully noted the date, time, and weather conditions in her neat handwriting. In just a few months, she had transformed from a child paralyzed by grief to a budding scientist with purpose and passion. Clara would have been so proud. As the sun began to set, turning the cemetery gold, they spotted movement at the tree line. Honey and Scout had become more comfortable with their presence over the weeks, sometimes grazing within view while Sophie and Tom sat quietly on their bench. But today there was something new. Behind the two familiar deer were three smaller shapes, the released fawns now firmly part of Honey's adopted family. Sophie quickly made notes in her journal, her pencil flying across the page. "Honey has brought the fawns to see Mr. Honey," she whispered excitedly. "She's introducing them." Tom put his arm around his daughter's shoulders as they watched the small herd approach the grave. Honey led the way, her movements calm and deliberate. The fawns followed, curious but cautious, while Scout kept watch from a short distance away. When they reached the garden, Honey gently nudged Mr. Honey with her nose, adjusting his position slightly as she often did. Then one by one the fawns approached, sniffing the teddy bear and the flowers surrounding him. "They're saying hello to Mom," Sophie said softly. Tom nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. He didn't have Sophie's absolute certainty about what the deer understood, but he couldn't deny the beauty of the moment or its healing power. As they watched, Honey did something she had never done before. She lay down beside the grave, folding her legs beneath her. After a moment's hesitation, the fawns did the same, settling into the grass around the garden like a family gathered for a story. Sophie wrote furiously in her journal, documenting every detail. But then she paused, putting her pencil down. "Dad," she said thoughtfully, "remember how I was really sad about leaving Mr. Honey here?" "I do," Tom replied. "You were worried about him being alone." Sophie nodded. But he wasn't alone. Not ever. And she looked up at her father with eyes that seemed older than her years. "Neither are we." Tom pulled his daughter close, kissing the top of her head. "No," he agreed. "We're not alone." As darkness began to fall, they packed up to leave. Sophie took one last photo of the deer family gathered around Mr. Honey and her mother's grave. She would add it to her growing collection, evidence of an extraordinary connection that defied explanation, but offered something more valuable: hope. "Goodbye, Mom," Sophie called softly as they walked away. "Goodbye, Mr. Honey. Goodbye, Honey and family. See you next week." The deer didn't startle at her voice. Instead, Honey raised her head, ears forward, watching as the humans departed. In the fading light surrounded by her adopted family, the doe kept her vigil, a wild creature honoring a promise that no one had asked her to make, but that she had chosen to keep. And in that choice was a message that had now touched countless lives, that love once given is never truly lost. It simply finds new ways to reach us.